In the 90s, we saw a surplus of video game franchises get the opportunity to not only live in our homes, but make the jump from the big screen. And sometimes those movies could be a hit, but a majority of the time, they were definitely a miss. The trend really started in 1993, and by the time the third live action movie based on a video game arrived, it was none other than Street Fighter. And now, with another Street Fighter movie on the way this year, I figured it was finally time to look back at the franchise's first trip to Hollywood and the game that came with it. The original Street Fighter movie is a complete time capsule of 90s action. You have Jean-Claude Van Damme, explosions, one-liners, and absolute legendary performers from the late great Raul and Julia, and a movie that took one of the biggest fighting games in the world and tried to turn it into a Hollywood blockbuster. But I don't really do movie retrospectives on this channel, so instead we're looking at something stranger. Because in the middle of what feels like 700 versions of Street Fighter 2, Capcom released a live-action movie based on Street Fighter 2. And then somebody decided to make it into a video game, based on the movie that was based on a video game. And somehow, we didn't just get one version of it, we got two. Two completely different games sharing the same name, the same movie, and ultimately, the same fate. Welcome to episode 5 of the Street Fighter Takeover. Today, we're going Hollywood and checking out Street Fighter, the movie.
Let's get going.
Disgrace to your art.
Sure you can!
Are you ready for this? Attention!
Face the might. Worthless.
Imagine this, no gun, no knife. It's a one-on-one, son.
To those who know me, welcome back. And to those who are new, welcome to the channel. I am the Retro Phantom, and here on the channel, I like to cover the games that help make gaming great. Right now, we are in the middle of the Street Fighter Takeover, covering the history of the Street Fighter series as we build up towards the new Street Fighter movie. And trust me, we still have a surplus of videos coming. So I would love for you to be a part of that ride. Hitting that subscribe button is the best way to make sure you're here whenever the next video drops. And if you enjoy the video and want to support the channel, the best thing you can do is like and hype the video. Doing so tells YouTube that content like this deserves to keep rotating through the YouTube algorithm. And if you're feeling a little generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description. With that said, let's dive into this. If this is your first video in the takeover, here's a quick recap, but if you're already caught up and know the story so far, feel free to advance past this recap. I'll give you a moment to do that now. It all started in 1987 with the original Street Fighter, a game that introduced us to Ryu, Ken, Sagat, and the basic foundation for what the series would eventually become. It had the special moves, the 6-button control scheme, and the idea of traveling around the world fighting different opponents. But it wasn't the Street Fighter we know today. The controls were rough, the special moves were difficult to pull off, and most of the characters would disappear from the franchise for years. The original Street Fighter wasn't the game that changed the world, but it was the experiment that created the foundation. Then, things got weird. In 1990, Capcom released Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight, a futuristic action platformer that had almost nothing to do with Street Fighter. In Japan, the game wasn't even connected to the franchise, but when it came to America, Capcom transformed the main character into Ken Masters and tried to sell it as some bizarre sequel taking place 25 years in the future. Yeah, that actually happened. But while Street Fighter 2010 showed just how lost the franchise still was, everything changed 1 year later. In 1991, Street Fighter 2 had hit the scene, And this was the game that changed everything. Capcom took the ideas from the original Street Fighter and finally figured out what worked. The controls were more responsive, the roster was more diverse, every character had their own fighting style, and for the first time, other characters in the game had their own endings. Street Fighter 2 didn't just become a successful sequel, it became a phenomenon. Arcades exploded, fighting games became one of the biggest genres in the world, and Street Fighter became one of the most recognizable video game franchises on the planet. But with success came a new problem. Capcom kept releasing it and releasing it and releasing it. Street Fighter 2 became Champion Edition, then Hyper Fighting, then Super Street Fighter 2, and finally Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Every new version responded to something that happened in the fighting game market, adding new characters, increasing the speed, improving the balance, and eventually introducing super combos. But after years of updates, Capcom started wondering if they were oversaturating the market. Street Fighter needed something fresh. They weren't ready for Street Fighter 3, so instead, Capcom decided to do a little experiment. And that experiment became Street Fighter Alpha in America, known as Street Fighter Zero in Japan. Rather than making another Street Fighter 2 update, Capcom went backwards in the timeline and created a prequel that's set between Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2. A mixture of veteran developers and young employees took a forgotten characters from the first game, crossed over with Street Fighter with Final Fight, and introduced new fighters that gave the entire series a colorful anime-inspired identity. The game experimented with almost everything: alpha counters, air blocking, tech rolls, a 3-level super combo gauge, auto mode for beginners, dramatic battles, and a greater focus on the characters and lore of the Street Fighter universe. It showed us Ryu and Ken's rivalry before Street Fighter 2. It explored Sagat's obsession with revenge. It showed us the beginning of Chun-Li's war against Bison, Charlie's battle against the Shadulo, Ken meeting his future wife, and even introduced Dan as Capcom's walking, talking shot at SNK. Street Fighter Alpha was an experiment, and it worked. By 1995, Street Fighter had gone from a rough arcade game to a bizarre futuristic sequel to the fighting game that changed the industry, and finally to a successful prequel that proved the franchise could still evolve beyond Street Fighter 2. But there was one thing. While Capcom was experimenting with the future of Street Fighter in Japan, Hollywood had already come calling, which brings us to today.
This is Chun-Li Zan with GNT News. AN forces are consolidating their hold on Shadaloo City today. They know that defeating the Ragtag City militia is one thing. Defeating the heavily armed forces of General M. Bison is quite another.
Jean-Claude Van Damme and Raul Julia wage a no-holds-barred battle of strength and skill in the explosive action-adventure Street Fighter, inspired by the phenomenally successful interactive video game.
The date was May 28th, 1993. Nintendo had finally broken into Hollywood with the release of Super Mario Bros., the first live-action film based on one of gaming's biggest icons. While the movie itself wasn't exactly a critical success, it showed Hollywood that video games were becoming the next big property worth adapting. A year later, Double Dragon will also make its way to the big screen, proving that studios were willing to take chances on gaming franchises. Capcom watched this unfold from the sidelines. At the time, Street Fighter 2 had become one of the biggest games on the planet. Arcades were packed, home console sales were through the roof, and their only true competition in the fighting game genre was Mortal Kombat. If Hollywood wanted video games, then Capcom wanted its biggest franchise to be a part of them. Around the middle of 1993, Capcom began looking for the right people to bring Street Fighter to the big screen. After hearing multiple pitches, they eventually met with producer Edward Pressman, known for producing films like The Crow and later on American Psycho. Alongside him was Stephen E. DeSouza, a screenwriter responsible for some of the biggest action films in the 80s, including Commando and Die Hard. DeSalza's vision wasn't to create Street Fighter 2. Instead, he pitched something much closer to a James Bond-style action film. Rather than focusing on a worldwide martial arts tournament, his story centered around an international military operation led by Colonel Guile. On paper, the idea made sense. If the movie was going to be a large-scale military action film, Guile naturally fit the role of the main protagonist. To make matters even bigger, they managed to cast arguably the biggest martial arts action star in Hollywood at that time, Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile. It sounded like a match made in heaven, but almost immediately, reality started to set in. Capcom wanted the movie released before Christmas of '94. Considering this deal was being put together in the middle of '93, that gave production roughly about a year and a half to write the script, cast the film, build the sets, and shoot everything. Don't forget to edit it and complete the special effects. And then also have it ready for theaters. There was almost no room for delays. On paper, everything looked promising. Street Fighter was the biggest name in the gaming. Jean-Claude Van Damme was the biggest action star in the world, and Capcom believed they had their next big blockbuster. Unfortunately, production would become a disaster. For starters, this would be Steven E. DeSalza's first time sitting in a director's chair. Up until this point, he had built an incredible career writing blockbuster action films, but directing an entire feature film was something completely new. In fact, as of today, Street Fighter remains the only feature film he has ever directed in his entire life. That meant he wasn't just directing the movie, he was simultaneously writing the script while learning how to direct a major Hollywood production on the job. While his writing credentials were unquestionable, directing required an entirely different skill set, and unfortunately, there wasn't much room for learning when the schedule was already working against him. One of DeSalza's biggest creative decisions was making Guile the central protagonist instead of Ryu or Ken. Looking at it objectively, this wasn't a bad idea. Since this wasn't going to be a traditional tournament story, Guile made perfect sense as the military hero leading the operation against M. Bison. Ryu and Ken would instead become supporting characters woven into the larger plot. The problem was, longtime fans expected Street Fighter to revolve around Ryu. If that sounds familiar, think back to Mortal Kombat 2021. Instead of allowing Liu Kang to lead the story, the film introduced Cole Young as the main character, leaving many fans wondering why the franchise's true protagonist had been pushed to the background. Ironically, Street Fighter made a very similar decision nearly 3 decades earlier. Now, to be fair, Guile wasn't a brand new character like Cole Young. He was already one of the franchise's most recognizable fighters, so the comparison isn't exactly one-to-one, but the reaction was similar. Many fans questioned why the face of the series had been moved aside in favor for another character. And unfortunately for the production, this was only the beginning of the movie's problems. While Steven E. DeSalza was trying to find his footing as a first-time director, there was another problem that no one had set plan for. The man playing M. Bison, the late great Raul Julia, had recently undergone surgery after being diagnosed with stomach cancer. The production team wasn't informed about the severity of his condition before filming began, so the original shooting schedule had to be built around an actor who simply wasn't physically capable of keeping up with it. When the cast first met Julia back in Bangkok, actor Byron Mann recalled just how shocking his appearance was, saying, "He was like half the size he was in the Addams Family. He was unrecognizable from 4 feet away." Director Steven E. DeSalza immediately realized they couldn't film Julia the way they had originally planned. Looking back, he simply said, "He looked ghastly. We wanted to fatten him up." That single problem forced the entire production to change course. Originally, the film was supposed to begin with Raul Julia's dialogue-heavy scenes while the stunt team spent weeks preparing the action sequences. Instead, everything was flipped upside down. As the article would explain, Julia needed considerable time to regain body mass, so fights and action sequences were bumped forward, and the schedule was essentially flipped: action first, drama second. Now honestly, this decision probably saved the movie. It allowed Julia time to recover while his children joined him in Thailand, turning part of the production into a family vacation. Over the following weeks, his health slowly improved enough that he could continue filming. And despite everything that was going through physically, the people around him couldn't believe the level of professionalism he brought to the set. As actor Damien Champa remembered, as soon as they said action, this great actor came to life in this body that wasn't what it used to be. To his last breath, he was acting. Even the stunt coordinator, Charlie Percerni, spoke incredibly high of him, saying, Raul Julia was terrific. He wasn't afraid to do the stuff I had for him. He was willing to do anything. And honestly, that's one of the reasons Raul Julia's performance is remembered so fondly today. While nearly every aspect of this production seemed to be falling apart around him, he continued giving everything he had. Tragically, this would become the final theatrical film release during his lifetime before he passed away in October of '94. Now we talk about the stunt rehearsal problems. Unfortunately, the change in their production schedule created another problem almost immediately. By pushing all the action sequences to the beginning of the film, the stunt department lost something every action movie desperately needed at that time: time. Stunt coordinator Charlie Percerni had asked months in advance for rehearsal time with the actors before the camera started rolling. Instead, he found himself meeting many of the cast members for the very first time on set, while simultaneously being expected to choreograph fight scenes almost immediately. Looking back, Percerni explained, the first day of shooting was the two main actors. They were fighting. That's the big thing. You have to have rehearsal time. That's the bottom line. You have to have rehearsal time, and I didn't have any. Instead of weeks of planning and practicing, many of the fight scenes had to be created the same day they were filmed. The article even explains that Percerni and the flight crew improvised day of stunt choreography, sometimes moments before the sounds are called action. Think about that for a second. This isn't just any action movie. This is Street Fighter. The franchise is literally built around martial arts, special moves, one-on-one fights. Yet, the people responsible for making those fights happen barely had enough time to teach the actors what they were supposed to be doing before the cameras started rolling. And in some cases, the actors had to figure things out themselves. Byron Mann recalled preparing for the cage fight against Vega, where he was supposed to perform an elaborate sword kata before the battle began. Every day he asked if someone could teach him the routine, but nobody ever did. Then one morning he discovered they were filming it after lunch. His reaction was this: I was literally an hour away from filming this thing. I grabbed a Thai extra. He taught me the kata in about an hour. When you hear stories like that, it starts making sense why parts of the movie feel rushed. It wasn't because people didn't care. It was because the production had become one of the most long and provincial movies ever seen, and everyone simply trying to survive each day of filming. Now, while Julia was fighting one of the toughest battles of his life, the complete opposite problems were happening with the film's star, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Years after the release, Van Damme openly admitted that during production, he was battling serious drug addiction while filming Street Fighter. Director Steven DeSouza even joked about the complete contrast between his two biggest stars, saying, every day I'd ask if Julia had taken his meds and if Van Damme was off them. Unfortunately, it wasn't just rumors. According to DeSouza, Van Damme would frequently miss call times, forcing the crew to completely change the shooting schedule with little to no warning. As DeSouza recalled, Jean-Claude was supposed to show up at 7 in the morning and he wasn't there. Actually, he was wiped, recovering from the night before. So take a moment and think about that. You're already behind schedule. Your villain is recovering from cancer. Your stunt team has barely had time to rehearse. Now your leading actor isn't showing up. DeSouza said when Van Damme was absent, they had no choice but to start inventing entirely new scenes just to keep production moving. In his own words, I would just have to make up some on the spot. We'd invent some kind of fight involving Ken and Ryu and a security guard, but it was never rehearsed. It was made up on the spot. Even when Van Damme was on set, production wasn't exactly smooth. This also tells a story where Van Damme stopped an expensive action sequence because he believed he had accidentally said ladder instead of later. The crew spent hours resetting blood squibs, wire rigs, and explosions for only the next take to end with Van Damme actually saying, "Go, go, I'll catch you later." Stories like these paint a pretty clear picture of what production had become. The crew wasn't simply filming a movie anymore. They were surviving one day at a time. As if the cast scheduling problems weren't enough, the location itself began working against the production as well. The first half of filming took place in Thailand. On paper, it looked like the perfect location. Beautiful landscapes, authentic jungle environments, and a soundstage that the production had been assured could support a Hollywood blockbuster. Reality tells a completely different story. When the director turned off the lights in the soundstage, daylight rushed in. There were so many holes in the walls and ceilings, it was completely useless. The production wasn't just dealing with broken sets either. Crew members became physically ill. One producer suffered a heart attack and never returned. Another producer was seriously injured in a traffic accident. Even the local power station couldn't handle the demands of the production. To make matters even worse, the cast struggled with the intense heat and humidity. Actor Byron Mann remembered saying, "No one knew it would be that hot and humid. We were malnourished and not accustomed to the food. Everyone lost weight." The article even points out that if you watch the movie carefully, you'll notice actors sometimes appear noticeably thinner from one scene to the next because the production stretched over weeks while everyone was constantly losing weight. Then came perhaps the biggest blow of all. The local power station fell under the strain of the production, bringing filming to a halt. And by the time the crew had packed up and moved to Australia, the production had fallen behind 15 days. And remember, Capcom wasn't interested in moving the release date. So instead of gaining extra time, they now had less. When you take a step back and look at everything that happened, it becomes a lot easier to understand why Street Fighter the movie ended up the way that it did. There wasn't one problem, it was every problem. The schedule was already tight before filming started. The director was making his first feature film. The production schedule had to be rewritten because Raul Julia was battling stomach cancer. The stunt team had no rehearsal time. Jean-Claude Van Damme's absences forced the scenes to be rewritten on the fly. Thailand's production facilities fell apart. The crew lost over 2 weeks of filming. And despite all of that, Capcom refused to move the movie past Christmas. But even after the camera stopped rolling, the problems were not over. Originally, the film received an R rating from the MPAA. Steven DeSalsa explained, "I shot PG-13 and had to make it softer. That meant removing blood, trimming action sequences, and cutting around violence that had already been filmed. Ironically, those edits also removed many of the signature Street Fighter moments fans were expecting." DeSalsa even admitted, "We were supposed to have some special effects for Hadoukens, but we lost so much time. There was no time to put in the special effects. Just think about that. You're making a Street Fighter movie, and because production had gone so far off the rails, there wasn't enough time to include some of the franchise's most iconic special moves. That is almost unbelievable." In the end, Street Fighter wasn't a movie that failed because of one bad decision. It was a movie buried under a deadline after deadline, compromise after compromise, with every new problem creating 2 more behind it. Ironically, despite all those issues, the film still earned nearly $100 million worldwide against a budget of around $35 million, making it a financial success even if critics were nowhere near impressed. But for Capcom, the movie was only half the plan, because while all the chaos was happening behind the scenes, they still had another product to release, a video game based on the movie.
the directorial debut of Steven D'Souza, screenwriter of 48 Hours and Die Hard. Street Fighter stars Jean-Claude Van Damme as Colonel Guile, a commando who leads a band of underground street fighters on a covert mission to rescue civilians from a psychopathic, self-styled warlord named Bison, who is bent on world domination, played by Raul Julia.
All I want to do is to create the perfect genetic soldier.
Chun-Li Zhang, played by Ming-Na Wen, is a television reporter who has her own personal reasons for wanting to see Bison destroyed.
I don't want a story about Bison. I want his head.
Cammy, Guile's right-hand lieutenant, played by Australian pop singer Kylie Minogue. Sagat, played by Wes Studi, a gladiator who challenges Guile's fighting abilities.
Guile, that's me, Guile. I'm like a very strong, macho.
Bison, that's the character I play. Bison is the king of the bad guys.
Your turn now.
I've never had such a high caliber cast.
D'Souza places his large cast in Shadaloo, a fictional city torn from today's headlines.
Even the story itself is a story about a Desert Storm kind of situation.
The film has the Asian type of look. Then we have all those James Bond type of set. Also, we have the Saga world is like a deer hunter type of look, very smoky ambiance. But the people from Street Fighter will become alive.
Now, most of my time in my retrospectives, I don't talk about films that much for videos, but here it's a challenge to talk about the game if you never spoke about the movie. So now let's actually talk about the first iteration of the game. Now on paper, it sounds like the easiest decision in the world. You have one of the biggest fighting game franchises ever made, a Hollywood film to promote, and Christmas is right around the corner. Of course, your thought is to make a tie-in game, but according to those who worked at Capcom, that wasn't necessarily the case. Former Capcom producer Yoshinori Ono actually explained that the biggest reason this project moved forward wasn't because everyone believed it was going to be the next big hit. It was because Capcom's founder wanted it. As Ono recalled, I think the whole reason this project started was because the president of Capcom at the time, Kenzo Sugimoto, was a big movie fan, and he actually had always dreamed of making a movie out of one of Capcom's properties. The movie was a dream come true for him, and he felt very attached to it. And because Sugimoto wanted a game for the movie, even though Capcom Japan executive producer Yoshiki Okamoto and illustration group led by Akira Yasuda probably didn't think it would be very financially successful, they realized it was extremely important to Sugimoto, so they probably had no choice but to go along with it. So while the movie may have been a passion project for Capcom's president, not everyone inside the company shared the same enthusiasm. Some of the people leading Street Fighter itself reportedly weren't convinced the game would become a financial success, but when the founder of your company wants something done, it's gonna get done. By late '94, Capcom had already survived one of the most troubled productions in the company's history. The company still had a movie to market. They even held a premiere at their US headquarters in Sunnyvale, California to help promote it. It wasn't exactly the glamorous Hollywood red carpet they had envisioned, with many of the film's biggest stars absent from the event. In fact, Capcom former PR representative Chris Kramer jokingly recalled that MC Hammer did a drive-by, blasting the movie's theme song from a convertible before leaving. That story alone kind of sums up how strange this entire project had essentially became. But despite everything, Capcom wasn't about to let any of that promotion go to waste. If there was going to be a Street Fighter movie, there had to be a game right beside it. Interestingly, Capcom didn't simply want another version of Street Fighter 2. Fighting games had begun to change. Around the mid-90s, digitized actors had become the newest trend thanks to the explosive success of Mortal Kombat. While Street Fighter had dominated the early years of the genre, Mortal Kombat's realistic digitalized characters had captured industry attention, and suddenly, everyone wanted to make the next Mortal Kombat. Ironically, Capcom had something Midway never did. They already had real actors. Jean-Claude Van Damme, Raul Julia, Ming-Na Wen, Damian Ciampa, Byron Mand. An entire cast had already been filmed for this movie. So rather than drawing new sprites from scratch, Capcom decided to experiment with digitizing the movie's actors into a fighting game of their own. The interesting part, Capcom wasn't going to develop the arcade version themselves. Instead, they reached out to a relatively small studio called Incredible Technologies. Now, while that name may not ring a bell today, the studio actually had experience working with digitized sprites in fighting games, something Capcom was specifically looking for. Street Fighter movie art director Ralph Magoza explained why they were chosen, saying,
The project came to IT with our history with Capcom Bowling. We had a history with fighting games. We had done Time Killers and Bloodstorm, and we had done some digitized games. We had done Rimrock and Basketball and Hard Yards Football, and that was kind of the trend. Mortal Kombat had come out. It was a digitized game, so it was a huge hit. I think Capcom was looking to kind of riff off of that, right? Street Fighter is a huge license, but they wanted to kind of tap into the whole digitized vibe. They had a movie that they were producing. They wanted us to film the actors in the movie to put into not only our game, but they were also producing a version for consoles for the PlayStation. There's supposed to be 2 film crews, but they ended up giving us their shot list, and we shot all of their moves as well. So we were working in tandem with the Japanese production team. It was, Capcom's idea to do that. Once again, Mortal Kombat was huge and was eating into, I think, their audience with Street Fighter, right? So they wanted to take a piece of that back. We were always the little guy taking on the big guys with these bigger companies.
So for Incredible Technologies, this wasn't just another licensed game. It was the biggest opportunity the studio had ever received, chasing Mortal Kombat. But this decision showed something else. For years, Street Fighter had been the king of fighting games. Now, Capcom was chasing someone else's trend. And here's where things get funny. Even people inside of Capcom wasn't exactly confident about this. If you look at Chris Kramer, he admitted that he accidentally hinted online that fans probably shouldn't expect too much from the project. He recalled, "I think I tried to say something fairly neutral, but it was pretty clear to people that I was like, don't expect this to be any good." The developers actually saw his comments online, complained directly to Capcom Japan, and Kramer actually got reprimanded for that. He even had to sit through a presentation where the developers tried convincing him the game would be just as good as any Street Fighter title. That tells you there were already questions surrounding this project long before it had ever reached arcades. Development finally kicked off in Australia, where the team planned to digitize the movie's actors while filming was still taking place. Originally, the plan was simple: fly to Australia, capture everyone's animations, go home. But just like the movie, things didn't exactly go according to plan. Elaine Hawkinson explained, "The original idea was we were only going to be there for maybe 2 weeks. Then something unexpected happened." During the meeting, Capcom president Kenzo Sugimoto proudly told everyone that Street Fighter had earned Capcom over $1 billion. Unfortunately, the actors were sitting in the room. Hawkinson recalled exactly what happened next. All of a sudden, the actors demanded that they wanted more money. The actors and their agents began renegotiating contracts so they could receive royalties for appearing in the video game. Instead of spending 2 weeks in Australia, the team ended up staying for nearly 6. As Hawkinson explained, what was supposed to be like 10 days, 2 weeks, eventually turned out to be 6 weeks in Australia.
So And at the same time, we were doing Street Fighter, the movie, the game, which was a paying thing. Once again, they were paying us for that. So that helped make money enough so that we could do these other things. That was in 95. But in 94, we bought out all the stakeholders in Strata that weren't us. Because we said, you know, this isn't working. It's like not worth very much. And so I think we gave some pretty generous, for what we had, money to the people who did that, and probably a lot of them are still with us, quite honestly. And so games were marketed under Strata, but they really were the same people that make games here at Incredible Technologies.
We were much better at making games than working with other companies making games. There wasn't much enthusiasm for that versus make our own and sell our own. So anyway, Capcom came to us because we knew how to digitize characters. It was fairly new then. Now all these things seem so easy, but back then they didn't know how to position the actors and film them and digitize them, get them into a game. And Mortal Kombat was one of the first that did that. So they hired us to fly down to Australia. We ended up being there 8 weeks. The chairman of Capcom had a nice big party, and he gave a nice little speech about Street Fighter 2 and said how the game had made billions of dollars. All of a sudden, all the actors wanted more money.
Most of that time was spent waiting for negotiations, waiting for actors, waiting for permission to continue digitizing. The developers would often sit in front of a blue screen with nothing to do while contract discussions played behind the scenes. Ironically, the game based on a movie that had already suffered endless production delays was now experiencing delays of its own. By the time digitization was finally complete, Incredible Technologies had spent weeks longer in Australia than everyone had originally planned. The project had already suffered delays before a single line of gameplay had truly been finalized, and just like the movie it was based on, the development had become another lesson in constantly adapting to unexpected problems. What's interesting, though, is that this wasn't even Capcom Japan's vision. Former Capcom USA Senior Vice President Joe Morrissey later recalled, "If I remember correctly, Capcom Japan wasn't really high on the idea of doing the movie version, so we chose to start development for the movie version because Capcom didn't really want to do it in Japan. So we took it over here and went to Incredible Technologies. And honestly, this wasn't the next evolution of Street Fighter. This wasn't Street Fighter 3. This wasn't Capcom Japan's next flagship fighting game. It was a licensed movie tie-in developed primarily in America by a studio of roughly 30 employees that suddenly found itself carrying one of the biggest fighting game franchises in the world while trying to compete directly with Mortal Kombat. That's a tremendous amount of pressure. But eventually, everything came to an end. And in March of 1995, Street Fighter the movie dropped in arcades, returning to where everything had started. Now, before we jump into the gameplay itself, there's something important we need to clear up. When people talk about Street Fighter the movie, they're usually talking about two completely different games. The first one is the arcade version, developed by Incredible Technologies, the same studio we've been talking about throughout the video's background information section. The second is the home console version, developed by Capcom Japan for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Despite sharing the same name, these are two completely different experiences. So to avoid confusion, we're going to cover them separately, starting with the arcade version. Now, if it wasn't for making this Street Fighter Retrospective series, I probably never would have played this game. Thankfully, through emulation, I was finally able to experience it for myself. And honestly, it wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. Don't get me wrong. It isn't going to replace Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo or Street Fighter Alpha anytime soon. But after everything we learned about its troubled development, I expected something almost unplayable. Instead, I found a surprisingly competent arcade fighter. Visually, the game actually looks pretty impressive for 95. The digitized actors are cleanly captured. The animations are fairly smooth, and unlike many other digitized fighting games from that era, the movement doesn't feel nearly as stiff as I expected. Because the game uses footage captured directly from the actors on the movie set, you're literally controlling Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile, Byron Mann as Ryu, Damien Chapa as Ken, Raul Julia as Bison, and the rest of the film's cast. It's certainly strange seeing these movie versions replace the classic sprites, but that's also what gives this game its unique identity. Gameplay still follows the traditional one-on-one Street Fighter formula. Rounds are fought in familiar fashion, special moves return, super moves make an appearance, and the game even rewards players for learning longer combo strings with flashy combo finishers that make fights feel satisfying once you start mastering them. Another mechanic unique to the arcade version is the addition of pop-up attacks. Certain normal attacks can launch your opponent into the air, allowing you to contain the assault with air juggles. It's a surprisingly flashy mechanic that gives experienced players another way to experience their combos beyond what you normally expect from a movie tie-in fighting game. That said, this definitely is not a beginner-friendly fighting game. Coming from Street Fighter Alpha, I immediately noticed this demands much more precision. The AI can be pretty unforgiving. Special move timing takes some practice, and if you're completely new to fighting games or Street Fighter, you're probably going to lose a lot before things finally start clicking. The roster is also fairly respectable, featuring many of the movie's major characters including Ryu, Ken, Guile, Chun-Li, Cammy, Sagat, Vega, Balrog, E Honda, Soeda, Zangief, Blade, and Bison, and surprisingly, even though he wasn't in the film, not that I saw, Akuma. On top of the 14 character roster, the arcade version also hides unlockable fighters. Arcane and Kyber can both be unlocked through secret button combinations, while a player later discovered the unfinished hidden character known as F7 still exists within the game's code. Although F7 was never intended to be a standard playable character, it even reuses Blade's ending. Its existence shows that Incredible Technologies experimented with even more content than what was ultimately shipped. Arcane and Kyber, two original fighters created exclusively for this version of the game. They are definitely some of the stranger additions in the Street Fighter universe. One thing I couldn't help but notice though, the influence of Mortal Kombat is everywhere. Not just through digitized actors, but even in the stage design itself. One arena features Cammy and E Honda chained up in the background, which immediately reminded me of Mortal Kombat 2's arena where Sonya and Kano were held captive when you're facing Shao Kahn. Of course, returning from previous Street Fighter games are super moves, but they're handled a little differently here. Instead of filling your super meter by taking damage or landing attacks, your meter grows simply by performing special moves, whether they connect or not. Every Hadouken, Sonic Boom, 100-hand slap inches your meter closer to a devastating super attack. Even more interesting, every character actually has two different super moves. A blue super, which is generally easier to execute, and a red super, which typically deals more damage but requires more difficult inputs. It gives players a choice between consistency or higher risk for a greater reward. If using your super meter offensively isn't your style, the game also introduces regen moves. Instead of spending your full super bar on powerful attacks, you can sacrifice it, restore a portion of your health. It's a simple mechanic, but one that adds another strategic decision during close matches. The game also retains classic dizzy system. Although it's happening entirely behind the scenes, every successful hit slowly fills an invisible stun counter, with attacks to the head causing even more stun. Once that hidden meter reaches its limit, your opponent becomes dizzy, leaving them completely vulnerable to punishment. Depending on your character, you'll either see stars or birds circling above their head. Throws also receive much more attention than I expected. Every character has multiple throw options, but landing one is only the beginning. Your opponent can escape the throw altogether, counter it, and have the counter reversed, or even finish the exchange with what's known as a slam master. Rather than guaranteed damage, every grab becomes its own little mind game, rewarding players who understand the system. Speaking of combos, I also found it interesting that Incredible Technologies intentionally prevented them from becoming overpowered. Instead of allowing long combo strings to completely melt an opponent's health bar like many fighting games of that era, Every additional hit deals progressively less damage than the last. It's a form of combo scaling that rewards style without completely breaking the game's balance. Ironically, that's a design philosophy modern fighting games still use today. When you take a step back and look at everything together, it's honestly surprising just how much is packed into this one game. Between interrupt moves, pop-up attacks, throw counters, throw escapes, comeback moves, regen, multiple super moves, hidden characters, and combo scaling, the arcade version is far more mechanically depth than its reputation would have you believe. Whether every mechanic is perfectly balanced is a discussion entirely. But after finally playing it for myself, I walked away respecting just how ambitious Incredible Technologies really was. Now, despite being based on the live action film, Street Fighter the movie still carries over one of the franchise's traditions: individual character endings. Just like the previous Street Fighter titles, every fighter received their own conclusion after completing the arcade mode. However, there's one important thing to keep in mind. The arcade version and the home console version feature completely different endings. Neither of them should be viewed as canon to the overall Street Fighter storyline. Instead, they're looked at as fun what-if scenarios that expand on the movie's universe. We'll start with the man who became the face of both the movie and the game, Colonel Guile, who was played by Jean-Claude Van Damme. Guile successfully leads the Allied nations' army to victory over M. Bison, finally bringing an end to the Shadulo's reign of terror. Although he's offered promotions and some of the military's highest honors, Guile declines them all. Instead, he resigns from the army and begins a worldwide search for his horribly mutated friend, Blanca, refusing to leave him behind. Next, we have the game's main antagonist, M. Bison, portrayed by the late great Raul Julia. In Bison's ending, history takes a much darker turn. With Colonel Guile and the Allied nations' army eliminated, no one remains capable of stopping him. Bison successfully establishes Bisonopolis, and from there, his tyrannical rule spreads across the globe, fulfilling the very dream he pushed throughout the film. Moving on to Chun-Li, brought to life by Ming-Na Wen. After finally avenging the murder of her father, Chun-Li finds the justice she has spent years searching for. With her family's honor restored and her revenge complete, she returns to the United States, where she leaves journalism behind and begins a new chapter of her life as a medical resident in a Chicago emergency room. Next up is Ken Masters, portrayed by Damien Chapa. As Bison's entire empire collapses around him, Ken does what Ken does best. He finds an opportunity to profit. Using his charm and street smarts, he negotiates a series of secret deals that leave him with the life of luxury. Despite his newfound fortune, however, Ken remains committed to the teachings of his respected master, Shang Long. Next up is Lieutenant Cammy White, who was brought to life by Kylie Minogue. After helping bringing down M. Bison and his forces, Cammy proves herself as one of the Allied nations' army's most capable leaders. Her actions on the battlefield earned her a promotion to general, making her the first woman to lead an AN army. Moving on to Sagat, who was brought to life by Wes Studi. Rather than supporting Bison's dream of world domination, Sagat realizes that Bison's ambitions would have destroyed the very black market empire he has spent years building. After overthrowing Bison, the people of the Shadaloo hail Sagat as their new leader, giving him control over both the city's legitimate government and its criminal empire. In doing so, Sagat becomes one of the most respected and feared leaders of the modern era. Next up is Ryu, portrayed by Byron Mann. With Bison's empire finally in ruins, Ryu leaves behind the life of a wandering fighter and dedicates himself to rebuilding the war-torn city of the Shadaloo. Guided by the teachings of Master Shang Long, he helps restore dignity, peace, and prosperity to a land that had known little more than conflict. Now we have Balrog, portrayed by Gran L. Bush. After overcoming impossible odds and defeating the power-hungry Bison, Balrog proves to both himself and the rest of the world that he is still a true champion. With Bison no longer standing in his way, Balrog returns to a professional boxing ring and reclaims his world championship title. Next up is E. Honda. With Bison defeated and the conflict finally behind him, Honda leaves his job as a G&T news technician and returns home to Japan. Once back in the world of sumo, he quickly dominates the competition and reclaims the prestigious title of Yokozuna, cementing his legacy as one of the sport's greatest wrestlers. Moving on to Vega, portrayed by Jay Tavari. With both Bison's army destroyed and Sagat's removed from power, Vega quietly takes control of the Shadaloo's black market operations. Although his new position forces him to remain in the shadows, he continues entering Street Fighter tournaments whenever he can, proving that even as a crime lord, his obsession with testing his skill never truly faded. Now we have Zangief. Unlike many of the other characters, Zangief's ending is one of regret. After realizing far too late that Bison had manipulated him from the very beginning, he defeats his former leader, but is left haunted by the crimes he's committed while serving Shadulo. Unable to escape the guilt of his past, Zangief leaves the city behind and disappears, never to be heard from again. Next up is Captain Sueda, and understand something, this is probably the first time you're hearing this character if you're not familiar with this game or the movie. So understand, he's portrayed by Japan Action Club actor Kenya Sueda. So it's actually based on a real person. Although Sueda was created specifically for the film, he was originally intended to appear in the live action movie as a playable fighter character. He ultimately found a way into the game instead, following the Allied nation's victory over Bison. Sueda is promoted to commander, where his strong leadership and unwavering integrity earned him a reputation as one of the world's most beloved leaders. Now I'm going to talk about Akuma. Unlike the movie's cast, Akuma was never part of the film. Instead, he was supposed to serve as a hidden bonus character for longtime Street Fighter fans, but as you can see, he's a selectable character here in this game. In his ending, Akuma defeats both Ken and Ryu, bringing shame upon his hated brother Shang Long. With his greatest students defeated, Akuma claims the ancient powers for himself and moves one step closer to eradicating Shang Long and everything he represents. This canon is strictly based for this game. This is not the entire canon of Akuma. I just want to make sure that's clear. And now we have Blade. Blade is an original character specifically for the live action movie. Throughout the film, he appears as one of Sagat's trusted associates, but in reality, he's working undercover, secretly feeding information back to Colonel Gaia as part of a long-term infiltration of Bison's criminal organization. After Bison's defeat, Blade's mission finally comes to an end. With his cover no longer needed, he leaves the world of espionage behind and returns to his true identity, Gunlock, the professional wrestler from Capcom's Saturday Night Slam Master Series. It's a clever crossover that connects the movie to one of Capcom's franchises and explains why Blade's ending feels so different than the rest of the cast. When Street Fighter the movie finally arrived in arcades during '95, the reception was definitely mixed. Commercially, the game had performed fairly well. It ranked as the 13th highest grossing arcade game in Japan during July of '95, while in North America, it reached 9th place on Replay's list of most popular arcade games in that same month. Looking back, Maximum Magazine even described the game as being reasonably successful in the arcades. So despite its unusual premise, players were at least willing to give the game a chance. Critically, however, reviewers couldn't quite decide what to make of it. Next Gen awarded the game just 2 out of 5 stars, criticizing its overall execution, but they also acknowledged that beneath the digitized movie actors was a surprisingly deep fighting system. They specifically praised the addition of mechanics like interrupt moves, throw counters, comebacks, regions, and 2 unique super moves for every character, arguing that these features actually expanded upon Street Fighter's traditional gameplay rather than simply copying and pasting Mortal Kombat. The magazine also praised the game's animation, noting that each fighter contained the average of over 700 individual animation frames, allowing for fluid movement and lengthy combo strings that were impressive for that time. Even so, the overall presentation struggled to win critics over. While many appreciated the mechanical depth, they felt the digitized visuals, excessive gore, and obvious attempts to capitalize on Mortal Kombat made the game feel more like a trend follower than the next evolution of Street Fighter. Ironically, that's become the story of the arcade version as a whole. Hidden beneath the movie license was a genuinely ambitious fighting game with mechanics that rewarded dedicated players. Unfortunately, it's connected to the film. And what happened when it arrived on home consoles would largely overshadow everything it actually did well. That, however, is only half of the story. Everything we've covered so far has focused exclusively on the arcade version of the movie, developed by Incredible Technologies. But when Capcom brought the title to home consoles, players didn't receive a simple arcade port. Instead, they were given an entirely different game, built by Capcom themselves, sharing the same name, same characters, same movie license, but offering a completely different experience. So now, let's leave the arcade behind, and let's look at the home console.
Street Fighter, the movie. For Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation will blow you away. Light years beyond any other game in the Street Fighter universe. It's the gut-wrenching fight of your life. Experience non-stop action with eye-popping digitized graphics. Battle head-to-head with the stars of the movie. Attack and defend with hundreds of outrageous moves. The clock is ticking. The world is watching. And the fight has just begun. Street Fighter the movie for Saturn and PlayStation is coming soon. Out here, it's a whole other game.
Now we talk about the home version. While Incredible Technologies handled development of the arcade release, you may be surprised to hear that Capcom developed the home version in-house. The main reason was that Capcom wasn't completely satisfied with the arcade version's game direction. The arcade release leaned heavily into digitized actors and Mortal Kombat fighting style mechanics, while Capcom wanted to preserve the traditional Street Fighter feel by using their own fighting engine and mechanics on home consoles. The game was released in Japan on August 11, 1995, under the title Street Fighter Real Battle on Film. In North America and European markets, it was published by Acclaim Entertainment, launching on August 23, 1995. In North America and later that September in Europe, it was released for the PlayStation 1. Now, unlike most games in the series where players simply receive an arcade perfect port at home, this wasn't the case here. Although Capcom reused the digitized actors from the movie, they built an entirely different fighting game underneath. If you remember from the arcade selection, Incredible Technology developed a version using its own unique engine. The home release instead runs on Capcom's engine, making these two games feel completely different despite sharing the same name. The roster also saw some major changes. Characters like Blade, Arcane, Kyber were removed entirely, while Akuma returned to being a hidden unlockable character instead of appearing on the select screen from the start. In exchange, Capcom added Blanca and DJ, two longtime Street Fighter characters who never appeared in the arcade version. Right away, it's obvious this isn't simply an arcade port with a few extra features. Even something as simple as the character select screen had been completely redesigned. Combos require much stricter execution, relying on traditional Street Fighter links and timing instead of the more forgiving combo system found in the arcade release. Whether that's a good thing or not really comes down to personal preference, but after spending time with both versions, the difference is definitely noticeable. One area where the home version does stand out is in its exclusive game modes. Alongside the standard versus battle and street battle, which serves as the game's traditional arcade mode, trial battle, and a new mode called movie battle. I'm going to start with talking about movie battle. This mode exclusively follows Guile through the events of the live action film. As Guile, you're constantly communicating with Cammy while searching for Bison's hidden fortress under a strict time limit. Rather than simply moving from one fight to the next, the mode introduces a decision-based system where you can choose Guile's next destination. If you've seen the movie or already know the correct route, it's fairly straightforward to reach the ending. However, the mode also features an alternate ending if you fail your mission, giving players another incentive to replay it. So here's how the movie battle essentially plays out. The mode exclusively follows Guile through the events of the live-action film. You begin with Guile arriving in Thailand alongside the Allied nation's peacekeeping forces, only for M. Bison to launch a surprise offensive attack and capture hundreds of hostages. After an opening battle between Guile and Bison, the story shifts to Bison's fortress, where he demands a complete withdrawal of the Allied nations and a ransom of $1 billion, just like in the movie. With only 50 minutes before the timeline expires, Cammy contacts Guile over the radio, and the mission begins. Unlike the standard arcade mode, Movie Battle introduces a simple decision-based map where you choose Guile's next destination. Following the events of the film, the best route is through the city, where Guile encounters Chun-Li, Balrog, and E. Honda while gathering intelligence on Bison's whereabouts. One thing I liked was that the information isn't simply handed to you. Most of the characters challenge Guile before they're willing to help, giving you a reason to fight while still progressing the story. After proving itself against Balrog and Chun-Li, Guile finally learns the location of Bison's fortress. Just as the Allied nations prepared to launch their assault, the Deputy Secretary offers a ceasefire and proposes paying Bison's ransom instead. Guile and Cammy reject that order and move forward with the attack anyway, just as they do in the film, choosing which way to infiltrate, either by boat or by truck. Choosing to infiltrate by boat leads directly into the assault on Bison's headquarters, complete with a short cinematic scene that recreate many of the movie's biggest moments. From there, the mode becomes almost a boss gauntlet. Guile fights his way through Blanca, Zangief, Vega, and Sagat, each battle bringing him one step closer to Bison himself. After finally defeating Bison, a cutscene recreates his apparent death by electrocution, only for Cammy to warn Guile that Bison isn't finished yet. Just like the movie, Bison returns for one final showdown, and after defeating him a second time, Guile finally brings an end to the Shadulo's reign. The mode concludes with the closing cinematic, followed by a music video inspired by the film, which I sadly cannot play due to copyright, but it's there. Now, I'm not against movie tie-ins following the film. In fact, I think creating iconic scenes can make players feel like they are part of the story. My biggest criticism is that the movie battle only lets you experience the events through Guile's perspective. I would have loved the option to play through as Ryu and Ken's undercover mission, Chun-Li's personal revenge story, or even a villain campaign where Bison successfully carries out his plans. There was so much material from the movie that could have been translated into traditional campaigns, and I think Capcom missed an opportunity there. Overall, I wouldn't call movie battle difficult. The time limit carries a little tension, but as long as you know where to go, it's fairly straightforward. It's a decent mode, but I think it lands somewhere around average rather than being a standout feature of the home release. If you happen to run out of time, however, the game rewards you, or shall I say, punishes you, with an alternate ending. Let's talk about Street Battle. Like a majority of Street Fighter games, this is your traditional arcade mode. You pick a single fighter and battle your way through the entire roster before taking on the final boss. On average, you're looking at around 12 fights per character, meaning if you wanted to complete the game with every fighter, including Akuma, you'd be looking at around 180 matches. Needless to say, there's plenty of content here if your goal is to see everything the game has to offer. Just like Street Fighter 2, the final boss is once again M. Bison. Unfortunately, there are still no bonus stages, so don't expect to be smashing cars or breaking stacks of bricks between matches. The home version also retains the 8 difficulty settings, and in true Capcom fashion, the game will still roast you during the ending if you choose to play on an easier difficulty. For players looking for an extra challenge, Akuma once again serves as a secret final boss. By setting the difficulty to level 8 and defeating every opponent without a continue, you reach the end of the arcade mode. Bison is swapped out for Akuma for one last battle. Because Capcom returned to its traditional fighting engine, Street Battle feels much more like a classic Street Fighter experience than the arcade version. Every playable character also receives their own ending, and surprisingly, these endings were completely different from those found in the arcade release. So if you're determined to unlock every ending, you'll have quite a few matches ahead of you. The last mode I want to talk about is Trial Mode. Since Versus Mode doesn't really introduce anything new, it's simply your standard one-on-one multiplayer mode. There isn't much to discuss there. Now, if you're looking for a cinematic payoff, you won't find it here. Trial Battle completely abandons its story and character endings in favor of pure test of skill. Instead of progressing through the narrative, you fight the entire roster and trying to complete it as fast as possible, which is then saved to your console. At the end of every match, the game analyzes your performance and grades you across multiple categories, giving you a detailed breakdown of how well you played. It's a mode designed for players who want to master the game's mechanics rather than experience the story. To make things even tougher, you don't have the luxury of adjusting the difficulty or relying on continues. Once you're defeated, the run is over. Personally, I found myself spending far more time in Street Battle mode than Movie Battle. While Movie Battle is a fun novelty for the first time, Street Battle is where the game's replay value really comes in. Now that I've covered the different game modes, let's talk about how the game actually feels to play. One thing that immediately stood out to me was the computer AI. Even on easier difficulties, the CPU can be incredibly cheap. As you progress further through a street battle, opponents begin reacting almost to anything you do. They punish unsafe attacks, counter predictable fireballs, and make you work for every single victory. It definitely isn't a game you can simply mash your way through, and by the time you reach the final boss, the challenge ramps up significantly. Fortunately, the controls themselves are not the problem. Like previous Street Fighter titles, the game uses the familiar 6-button layout, and Capcom's fighting engine shines through here. Special moves, throws, and combos are all responsive, making every victory feel earned rather than luck-based. Compared to the arcade version, movement feels noticeably heavier and slower. It's much closer to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo than the Mortal Kombat-inspired gameplay found in the arcade release. Whether that's an improvement really comes down to what type of fighting game you prefer. One mechanic I haven't mentioned yet is the introduction of enhanced special moves. By spending a portion of your super meter, certain attacks become more powerful versions of themselves. It's a small addition, but one that subtly changes the strategy of each fight since opponents can punish you for being reckless. It's the same thing we saw in the Alpha game. The super meter itself has also been reworked. Unlike many other Street Fighter games, it fills incredibly quickly, often after just a few special moves. Once it's full, you gain access to the enhanced specials as often as you like until you decide to spend the entire meter on traditional super combos. It creates an interesting risk versus reward system where sometimes it's actually smarter to save your meter from multiple enhanced attacks instead of using one flashy super. Visually, this is where the home version starts to lose some ground. While Capcom reused the digitized actors from the movie, the PlayStation and Saturn versions are clearly a step down from the arcade release. Character sprites are noticeably smaller, animations are less fluid, and many of the animation frames present in the arcade version simply aren't there. The result is a game that feels much choppier despite using the same source material. The battlegrounds do a respectable job recreating locations from the film, and a few stages look genuinely good, but overall, this isn't a game that's going to impress anyone from a visual standpoint. Ironically, the audio tells a different story. The soundtrack is easily one of the strongest aspects of the home release. Alongside the music from the live-action movie, Capcom also remixed several classic Street Fighter themes, giving the game a soundtrack that feels familiar while still fitting the movie's license. Unfortunately, the voice acting doesn't hold up nearly as well. Many of the digitized voice samples sound compressed and muffled, making some dialogue feel awkward compared to the crisp music playing underneath. Overall, I think the home version's biggest strength is its gameplay. Capcom successfully brought the series back towards its traditional roots while still experimenting with new mechanics. The presentation may not have aged particularly well, but underneath the digitized movie actors is a surprisingly competent, not great, but competent game that rewards learning the systems rather than simply button mashing. Now let's talk about the characters. In this game, we have Guile, Chun-Li, E Honda, Balrog, DJ, Sueda, Ryu, Ken, Zangief, Cammy, Vega, Sagat, Blanca, Bison, and like I said, hidden was Akuma. We will look into the endings compared to the arcade version and their canon character as well, because like I said earlier, this was a massive change overall, and one thing I definitely want to make notice of. I'm not new to Street Fighter as a game, but I am new to the lore of Street Fighter. So I'm still learning the series as I've been playing through this retrospective series. So I'm only going based off of what I have learned from Street Fighter, Street Fighter 2, and Street Fighter Alpha. So let's start with looking at Guile. If you've been following the retrospective series, you already know Guile's original Street Fighter story is centered around avenging his fallen friend Charlie Nash. Throughout Alpha and Street Fighter 2, everything Guile does is motivated by bringing Bison to justice for Charlie's death. That's the version of Guile most fans know. The movie completely changes that motivation. Instead of searching for Charlie, The live-action version makes Guile a commanding officer of the Allied nations' army, placing him at the center of an international military conflict against General Bison. That change also carries over into both versions of the game, but each one takes Guile's story in a different direction. In the arcade version, after defeating Bison, Guile declines promotions and military honors, resigning from the Allied nations army so he can begin a worldwide search for his horribly mutated friend, Blanca. It's a surprisingly emotional ending, one that mirrors the canonical loyalty to Charlie by replacing one lost friend with another. The home version takes a completely different approach. Rather than leaving the military behind, Guile becomes an international hero after the Allied nations' victory is broadcast around the world by GNT News. His leadership earns him a new assignment across Europe, the Middle East, and other global hotspots, effectively turning him into the world's go-to military commander whenever a new threat appears. When Chun-Li asks whether he's worried about facing another terrorist like Bison, Guile simply responds, "I don't care who they are. If they want to fight me, I'll kick their butts." He literally says that. Now, let's look at M. Bison. In the original Street Fighter canon, Bison is the ruthless dictator of the Shadulo, whose ultimate goal is world domination through the use of psycho power. While his organization profits from weapons, drugs, and countless other criminal operations, Bison himself is remembered as the mastermind pulling the strings from the shadows. The movie takes that idea and simply simplifies it. Instead of focusing on the Shadulo's criminal empire, the live-action version presents Bison as a military dictator openly waging war against the Allied nations. He's still obsessed with conquering the world, but rather than operating behind the scenes, he commands an army and threatens entire nations head-on. Both versions of the game continue that storyline, but once again, their endings take different paths. In the arcade version, Bison defeats Guile and the Allied nations army, allowing him to establish Bisonopolis. From there, his tyrannical rule spreads across the globe as his dream of world domination finally becomes a reality. The home version expands on the victory even further. Rather than simply defeating Guile, Bison completely crushes the Allied nations' assault and unleashes his army of perfect soldiers across the world, with every nation falling beneath his rule. Bison's palace rises above Shadulo City as the symbol of a new empire. His vision of global domination is finally complete, ushering in what the ending describes as a new age of darkness under his banner. Out of everyone in the cast, I'd say Chun-Li is actually one of the characters the movie gets closest to her original Street Fighter counterpart. Just like in the games, her father was murdered by Bison, and ever since Street Fighter 2, avenging his death has been one of her primary motivations. Even the Alpha series reinforces just how personal that conflict is between them. Both versions of this game stay true to that idea, but they each imagine a very different future for Chun-Li after Bison's defeat. In the arcade version, Chun-Li finally avenges her father, restores her family's honor, and leaves her life behind to become a medical resident in a Chicago emergency room. It's an unexpected career change that has very little connection to her character in the main series, making it one of the stranger endings in the arcade version. But when we take a look at the home version, things feel much more in line with the movie itself. After Bison's defeat and finally getting justice for her father, she continues her career as an international correspondent for Global News Television. Traveling the world, she reports on the international affairs and interviews with political leaders, thus becoming one of the most trusted journalists on the planet. The ending even closes with a little joke pointing out that despite all of her serious reporting, no one has ever questioned why she insists on wearing her iconic Chinese dress while interviewing Colonel Guile, which is a nice nod to the movie. Now let's look at Ken. So far throughout this retrospective series, Ken has become one of my favorite characters. While Ryu constantly is searching to become a stronger fighter, Ken has always seemed to be more interested in finding balance in his life. We eventually see him fall in love with Eliza, start a family, and realize there's more to life than simply chasing the next fight. That's one of the things I really enjoy watching develop as we moved on through the series. Of course, none of that exists in this movie universe. The arcade version, Ken uses the collapse of Bison's empire to make a fortune, hustling his way through a series of secret business deals that leave him living a life of luxury. But when you take a look at the home version, it takes a different approach. Instead of looking out for himself, Ken helps rebuild the city after Bison's defeat, putting his street smarts and resourcefulness to good use. His efforts eventually impress Guile enough to offer him a position with the Allied nations' forces. True to Ken's personality, though, he turns the officer down. Rather than becoming a soldier, he and Ryu go back on the road together in search of the next adventure. It's a much more optimistic ending, and one that captures the friendship between Ryu and Ken that we've seen throughout the entire series. Next up is Cammy. Now, I'll be honest with you all. I don't know Cammy's story as well as some of the other characters yet. Remember, this is my first time seriously experiencing Street Fighter's lore in chronological order, so I'm learning as I go. Up to this point, we've only really spotted her in one game, and her story is still unfolding before my eyes. We know Bison hints that the two shared a mysterious past. Cammy struggles with memory loss in the main series, and there's certainly more to her character that hasn't been revealed yet. The movie throws all of that out. Here, Cammy has no memory problems at all. Instead, she's portrayed as one of Guile's most trusted officers. And if anything, the film also teases a potential relationship between the two. It's a completely different interpretation of her character. The arcade version continued to build on that military role, but the home version expands on her role even more. Rather than remaining with the Allied nations permanently, Cammy returns to the British Secret Service after Bison's defeat. But because of the strong partnership she formed with Guile during the crisis, she's frequently loaned back to the Allied nations for special assignments. The ending even reveals that she and Guile are already preparing for another mission together in the Middle East, suggesting their partnership is far from over. Now, let's look at Sagat. From everything I'd experienced throughout the series, Sagat has always been defined by one thing: his defeat at the hands of Ryu. Ever since losing that fight and receiving the iconic scar across his chest, he has struggled to let go of that moment. His rivalry with Ryu became the driving force behind his character, constantly pushing him to prove that he could one day surpass the man who humbled him. Even when he joins Bison's crew, that obsession never truly disappears in the original games. The movie version couldn't be more different. Instead of being consumed by his rivalry with Ryu, Sagat is portrayed as a powerful black market arms dealer who only works with Bison because it benefits his own business. His loyalty isn't to Bison, it's to making money. The arcade version reflects that idea perfectly, where after realizing Bison's plans for world domination could ultimately destroy his own criminal empire, he turns against them. But when we look at the home version, this keeps him much closer to the character we've seen in the movie. Rather than trying to rule the Shadulo, Sagat simply disappears into the underground while the Allied nations restore order. Once they eventually leave, he quietly reclaims control of the city's black market and returns to doing what he's always done: selling weapons. Unlike the arcade ending, Sagat has no interest in politics or ruling a nation. As he puts it himself, making money is the only game he's interested in, and he will always play to win. since we spoke about Ryu with Sagat, let's actually talk about Ryu now. Throughout the Retrospective series, Ryu has constantly been portrayed as an honorable warrior whose only real goal is self-improvement. Whether it's leaving his own victory ceremony to continue training beneath the waterfall, or wandering the world in search of stronger opponents, Ryu has never cared about fame, fortune, or materialism. His journey has always been about becoming a better martial artist. The movie changes that quite a bit. Here, Ryu starts off more as a con artist instead of alongside Ken, before eventually becoming an undercover spy working to bring down Bison's empire. He's still one of the heroes, but unlike the games, he isn't the central protagonist. That role belongs to Guile. The arcade version gives Ryu one of the more unexpected endings. After Bison's defeat, he leaves fighting behind altogether and dedicates himself to rebuilding the war-torn city. The home version takes a route that I think fits the movie much better. After helping rebuild the city alongside Ken, the pair quickly fall back into their old routine. As soon as the reconstruction is finished, Ken starts planning their next money-making scheme, while Ryu reluctantly tags along, mostly trying to keep his best friend from getting into more trouble than he can handle. It's a lighthearted ending that perfectly captures the dynamic the movie established between the two of them. Next up is Balrog. If you remember back to Street Fighter 2, Balrog was introduced as one of Bison's elite bosses. He was inspired by Mike Tyson, obviously. In the story, Balrog was a disgraced heavyweight boxer who turned to working for the Shadaloo after being banned from professional boxing. Power and money were always his biggest motivations. The movie completely reinvents that character entirely. Instead of being one of Bison's enforcers, Balrog becomes one of Chun-Li's G&T News team workers, working as her cameraman while secretly help expose Bison's operation. It's a huge departure from his original role, but surprisingly, he still keeps his passion for boxing. The arcade version leans heavily into that idea, where after defeating Bison and overcoming the impossible odds, he proves himself that he's still a champion and eventually goes back to boxing. The home version expands that story even further. After Bison's defeat, Balrog returns to the United States and begins training once again. Fighting his way back through the ranks, he not only becomes heavyweight champion, but also captures the openweight championship, cementing himself as one of the greatest boxers in the world. Ironically, after accomplishing everything he set out to do, Balrog finds himself traveling once again as Chun-Li's cameraman. When asked why he returned, he jokingly says it was simply because he wanted to see Chun-Li in her famous Chinese dress one more time. Moving on to E Honda. Throughout the series, Honda has always fought with one goal in mind, proving that sumo wrestling deserves to be recognized and one of the greatest martial arts. Nearly everything he does revolves around restoring honor and respect to the sport he loves. The movie takes him in a very different direction. Instead of being a professional sumo wrestler, Honda becomes part of Chun-Li's investigative team, working alongside Balrog as the group's technical expert. It's definitely one of the stranger changes made for the film, especially considering how little it has to do with the original character. The arcade version quickly brings Honda back to his roots. With Bison defeated, Honda left his job and returned to Japan, where he once again dominates the world of sumo wrestling and reclaims the prestigious title of Yokozuna. The home version tells a very similar story, but adds a lot more personality. After Bison's empire collapses, Honda clears his name and returns to the sacred sumo ring. Once again, he rises to become the grand champion, proving he's still one of the greatest sumo wrestlers in the world. The ending even throws a bit of humor by revealing that his biggest challenge isn't another sumo wrestler at all. It's the ongoing series of sparring matches against Zangief. Their record sits at 86 wins for Honda and 85 wins for Zangief, 27 draws, and 5 destroyed sumo dojos, making it one of the funnier endings in the entire game. Now let's talk about Vega. Throughout the series, Vega has always been one of the more unique villains. Unlike many of the members of Bison's crew, Vega isn't motivated by power or revenge. He's obsessed with beauty and perfection, seeing himself as the ultimate fighter, while viewing everyone else as ugly beneath him. His narcissism is just as much a part of his character as his iconic claw and mask. The movie doesn't spend nearly as much time developing his personality, but it does keep him as one of Bison's elite assassins. Outside of that, there really isn't much connection to the original storyline. I mean, when you look at the arcade version, it imagines Vega taking advantage of the chaos after Bison's defeat. With both Bison's army destroyed and Sagat out the picture, he quietly assumed control of the Shadowloo's black market operations, although his new position forces him to remain in the shadows. But when you start looking at the home version, instead of becoming a crime boss, he reunites with Sagat after the fall of Bison's empire and returns to what he enjoys most: fighting. Back in the arena, Vega quickly establishes himself as one of the most feared competitors around the world. The ending even jokes that people no longer bet on whether Vega will win. Instead, they place a bet on how long his opponents will survive before he claws them apart. Thinking about it, this ending fits Vega's personality much better because it focuses on his obsession with proving his superiority rather than putting him in charge of a criminal empire. Now we go to wrestling with Zangief. One thing I've noticed while covering this series is that Zangief has never really been an evil character. In the main Street Fighter canon, he's a proud Russian wrestler who genuinely wants to represent his country and prove his strength. Whether he works alongside Bison, he isn't driven by greed or desire for world domination. More often than not, he's simply being manipulated into believing he's doing the right thing. The movie leans into that idea even more. Rather than portraying him as a ruthless enforcer, he's mostly a comedic character throughout the film. He's loyal to Bison because he honestly believes he's fighting for a good cause, only realizing the truth near the end of the story. When we look at the arcade version, this gives him a surprisingly dark conclusion. After learning that Bison has been leading him towards his own destruction, he defeats his former leader but is left haunted by the terrible things he'd done while serving him. Unable to live with that guilt, he left the city and was never heard from again. The home version is far more optimistic than that. After realizing Bison had deceived him, Zangief returns home to Moscow and resumes his professional wrestling career, where he quickly proved that no one can match his strength. With little left to conquer in the ring, he occasionally assists Guile's security team while continuing his friendly rivalry with E Honda throughout the training matches in Japan. Out of the two endings, this one feels much more in line with the Zangief we come to know throughout the series, a powerful but ultimately good-hearted fighter who simply wants to test his own strength against worthy opponents. Now let's talk about DJ. It is worth mentioning that DJ and Blanca are two exclusive to the home console versions, so neither of these next two characters received arcade endings, just so you know. So now we're going to start with DJ. Now, this is another example of the movie taking a completely different approach to a Street Fighter character. Up until this point in the series, DJ has always come across as a fun-loving kickboxer with a passion for music and fighting. He's one of the more carefree characters in the roster and simply doesn't really fit into the world of spies and military espionage. The movie changes that entirely. Instead of being a world-famous kickboxer, he's reimagined as one of Bison's communications experts and computer specialists. It's a completely different role, but surprisingly, the game actually builds on it after the movie ends. In his ending from the game, DJ escapes Bison's fortress with nothing left to his name. Forced to work under Sagat as a new ruler of the underworld, he eventually steals Sagat's money and disappears. Thanks to his skills as both a hacker and an engineer, DJ quickly finds work throughout the criminal underworld, constantly moving from one place to another in search of the next big payday. It's an ending that fully embraces the movie's interpretation of the character rather than trying to connect him back to his arcade roots. Next up is Blanca. Now, from everything I experienced so far in the Retrospective series, Blanca's story has always been surprisingly wholesome. In the main Street Fighter timeline, his real name is Jimmy, and after believing he'd never see his family again, he's eventually reunited with his mother following the events of Street Fighter 2. It's one of the more heartfelt endings in the series, and it gives Blanca much more depth than just being a green monster. The movie throws all of that out the window. Here, Blanca isn't Jimmy at all. Instead, he is Carlos, a member of the Allied Nations who essentially takes place of Charlie Nash from the original Street Fighter storyline. After being captured by Bison, Carlos is transformed into Blanca through genetic experimentation. Even the movie battle mode, Cammy recognizing him, asking him if the creature before her is Carlos Blanca. It's one of the biggest creative liberties the film takes with any established character. His ending leaves his fate intentionally mysterious. As Bison's fortress collapses, Allied Nation soldiers report hearing the cries of a wild beast somewhere beneath the rubble. Despite Guile's desperate search, Blanca's body is never recovered. Rumors begin circulating that he's still alive and that Professor Damme is working to reverse the DNA mutations that transform Carlos into Blanca. Whether those rumors are true, it's never confirmed. But Guile remains convinced, ending the story with the simple promise that Carlos will return. Now let's go to the one character that made his way from the big screen into the living rooms, Captain Sueda. The arcade version saw Sueda rewarded for his bravery after Bison's defeat. He was promoted to the rank of commander, and his leadership and unwavering integrity earned him a worldwide admiration, eventually making him one of the most beloved military leaders in history. But when you look at the home version, this version expands that idea even further. Following the Allied Nations' assault on Bison's fortress, Sueda's technical brilliance earns him recognition throughout Japan's self-defense force, where he becomes a symbol of leadership and courage. Although he only serves alongside Guile on a handful of occasions, the two develop a tremendous amount of respect for one another. This ending even closes with Guile being asked who is the toughest soldier he's ever worked with. Without hesitation, he replies, "It's Captain Sueda." And finally, we have Akuma. Akuma has always been one of the most mysterious characters in the entire franchise. Even during his earliest appearances, Capcom intentionally revealed very little about him, letting his overwhelming power and quiet demeanor speak for themselves. That mystery is a huge part of what makes his character so compelling. Interestingly, the arcade version moves away from that. Instead of leaving his motives ambiguous, it reveals that Kuma has defeated both Ryu and Ken while continuing his vendetta against his brother Shang Long. That was only made for the arcade version. The home version does the exact opposite. Akuma doesn't receive any narration at all. Instead, the ending just shows him standing silently on the screen saying nothing. In many ways, I actually prefer this approach. By removing the extra story in the arcade version had created, the home release restores the mystery that made Akuma so fascinating in the first place. He doesn't need a lengthy explanation or an elaborate epilogue. His presence alone tells you everything you need to know. Now, let's be honest, Street Fighter the movie was never going to be remembered as one of the franchise's magnum opuses. While the home console version actually sold well during its launch, largely because it carried the Street Fighter name and released alongside Sony's brand new PlayStation, the positive sales didn't translate to a positive legacy. Looking back today, both versions are genuinely remembered as some of the weakest entries in the entire series. So you may wonder, what exactly went wrong? Well, I think it starts with the movie itself. Both the games were built around a film that was already struggling behind the scenes. The movie had rushed production, script rewrites, scheduling problems, and numerous issues during filming. By the time the games released, they were tied to a movie that critics had already figured was flawed. Whether it was fair or not, both games inherited that legacy long before players even picked up a controller or even approached the arcade machine. Then we have the visuals. Instead of the beautifully hand-drawn sprites that made Street Fighter 2 so iconic, or even the anime-inspired art style that made Alpha iconic, both of these versions relied on digitized actors taken directly from the movie. At the time, digitized graphics were incredibly popular because of Mortal Kombat, but Street Fighter simply was not Mortal Kombat. The real-life actors often looked and felt stiff, their animations lacked the fluidity fans expected, and many players felt the characters had fallen straight into the uncanny valley. Rather than feeling like the next evolution of Street Fighter, it looked like the series was trying to imitate its biggest competitor. Unfortunately, the problems did not stop there. The arcade version introduced mechanics that many players felt were awkward and inconsistent. While it wasn't a terrible game on its own, it simply didn't feel like a Street Fighter game. Longtime fans were expecting the precise controls and responsive gameplay Capcom has spent years perfecting. Instead, they were met with unusual combo systems, strange hit detections, and mechanics that never quite clicked with the community. Ironically, the home console version had the opposite problem. Rather than creating something entirely new, Capcom essentially built the game on top of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Mechanically, it was much closer to classic Street Fighter than the arcade version, but technical issues held it back. Reviewers frequently criticized the slowdown, sluggish animations, the long load times, muddy sprites, and inconsistent performance. Many described it as a version of Super Street Fighter 2 that actually felt worse to play. And of course, we got the biggest problem of all. It had an identity crisis. The arcade game didn't play enough like Street Fighter. The home game played too much like Street Fighter 2. One was trying to reinvent the formula, while the other one had barely evolved it. As a result, neither version truly found its own identity. Fans of traditional Street Fighter didn't fully embrace the arcade release, while players looking for something fresh found the home version to be a little more than a familiar game wearing the movie skin. Critics often reflected those same frustrations. Publications like GamePro and Electronic Gaming Monthly all criticized the various aspects of the game, ranging from sluggish controls, poor animation, bad graphics, and technical performance issues, while a handful of reviewers appreciated a larger roster, multiple game modes, and the attempt to merge movie with gameplay. The overall consensus was overwhelmingly mixed to definitely negative. Even today, that opinion has not changed much. Years later, US Gamer will list Street Fighter movie among the worst PlayStation launch titles, while UGO included it on its list of the worst video games ever made. Today, it's remembered less as a great fighting game and more as a fascinating experiment, a moment when Capcom tried to capitalize on Hollywood's success but lost sight of what made Street Fighter special in the first place. And honestly, I don't think either version is completely without merits. The arcade experimented with mechanics that were interesting, while the home version offered a surprising amount of content and one of the largest character rosters available at this time in Street Fighter's history. The problem wasn't that these games had no good ideas, it was that they were constantly being compared to one of the greatest fighting games ever made. That's the incredible difficult standard to live up to. And unfortunately, Street Fighter the movie simply couldn't escape the shadow of Street Fighter 2. Now, when it came to actually playing this game, truthfully, this has probably been my least favorite Street Fighter I've covered so far. It's not that it's completely unplayable or devoid of good ideas. It just never felt like Street Fighter to me. Throughout the series, I've really enjoyed watching the franchise grow. Whether it was the original game laying out the foundation, Street Fighter 2 becoming one of the greatest fighting games ever, or Alpha breathing new life into the series, every game felt like it had a clear identity. This one, it just doesn't. I actually like the idea of Street Fighter getting its own Hollywood movie. On paper, it makes perfect sense. The franchise was one of the biggest names in gaming around the time, so of course, Capcom was wise to expand it into films. It's just, this movie wasn't the right vehicle to do that. The production problems carried into both games, and you could really feel that everything was being rushed to capitalize on the home release. I also understand why Capcom leaned into the digitized actor look. Mortal Kombat had exploded in popularity, and everyone wanted a piece of that success. But Street Fighter never needed to become Mortal Kombat. Its identity had always been built on fluid animation, colorful sprites, and incredibly responsive gameplay. By chasing what was popular instead of building on what already made Street Fighter special, I think Capcom lost sight of what fans actually wanted. Looking back, I also wonder if the franchise was beginning to suffer from a little bit of oversaturation. By this point, we had already seen what felt like countless versions of Street Fighter 2, followed by Alpha, and now two completely different versions of Street Fighter the movie. As a player, I found myself asking, why would I spend time with this when I can just play Street Fighter 2 or Alpha instead? And being honest with you, I still have 14 other videos in this franchise to make, so why would I just play Alpha 2? Why don't I just play EX? Why don't I just jump into Street Fighter 3? Those games today and at that time already delivered everything people will love and everything I am enjoying about the series. And also, they even did it better. That said, I don't regret playing this game. If anything, this game represents an interesting chapter in Street Fighter's history. Capcom was experimenting. They were trying to figure out how far the brand could expand. And while this particular experiment didn't succeed, it showed the company was not afraid to take a risk. But of course, not every risk gives you a reward. But you ask yourself, would I ever come back to play this game? Honestly, probably not. For me, it was one of those games you experience once for the history, appreciate it for what it attempted, and then move on. I completely understand why so many people rank it among the weakest entries in the franchise. At the same time, I can also appreciate it as a fascinating time capsule from the mid-90s, a period when Hollywood and video games were trying to figure out how they can coexist. With a brand new Street Fighter movie on the horizon, I can only hope Capcom and Hollywood have learned a few lessons from this first attempt, because if they have, maybe things won't just be remembered as Street Fighter's first movie, but the stepping stone that eventually led to a better one. If you made it to the end of this video, I truly appreciate it. This one was definitely worth the exploration. But thank you for tuning in and rocking with me as always. We got a lot more Street Fighter vids coming down the pipeline, so if you enjoyed this video, you want to join me on this journey, the best way to do so is by subscribing to the channel. Next week, we're looking into Street Fighter Alpha 2. Also, we're getting closer to the 10,000 subscriber mark, and every single one of you helps make that goal possible. If you want to support the channel, the best thing you can do is like and hype the video, because it helps smaller creators like myself in YouTube's algorithm. And if you're feeling a little generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description below. With that said, this is the Retro Phantom, signing out.